Let's do a deep dive on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and see where we might be headed next on them. This chart is very interesting and it shows in red is the NASDAQ Mid-Cap Software Index. So all of the software names in the US economy. And the blue line, which seems to be very heavily correlated with this index, is the Bitcoin price. So what this tells me is the institutional money, the smart money, has essentially been throwing Bitcoin into the same basket that many tech stocks, many software companies are in. You know, companies like Adobe, maybe Duolingo, these kind of companies. Software which has been taking a massive hit in past times definitely has coincided with the top on Bitcoin. Now, of course, we know software has been going down. The narrative has been that it's because of AI and disruption coming to that space, and perhaps the growth will not be as good going forward, and they're going to be disrupted. I don't think you can really make that same narrative argument for why Bitcoin is going down, because, of course, Bitcoin is a rather different technology to a software company. It is decentralized. It is not quite as disruptible because it's got that network value. A lot of people have been using it. There's a lot of trust in the system because it's existed for many years, whereas okay, maybe you can disrupt a lesser known software company using AI and whatnot. Regardless, I do think all those fears in general are overblown, and at some point software will have its time in the sun again, which means Bitcoin will likely have its time in the sun again. And it's possible you may even break this correlation at some point, although that may not necessarily even be to the upside. It could in fact be to the downside for Bitcoin. Okay, so that's the first chart. We've got to keep in mind Bitcoin has been following the ups and downs, the swings in the software market in general. So what can we expect for Bitcoin price? Well, we know we're in a bearish trend right now. If we can throw on my custom indicator, we can see there was a sell signal and you entered a bearish regime, of course, and price has just sold off massively since then. Now, usually we don't want to fight the trend, and Bitcoin bear markets do tend to last quite some period of time. The previous bear market, for example, lasted around 400 days or so. So essentially a year, a little bit more than a year. By the time you do exit that bearish regime, though, price has already climbed out of the lows that it would have experienced. If we're assuming this bear market might be a similar duration, then that could put you out to perhaps December of 2026 when you are maybe exiting this bear market, if we're assuming the historical parallel is going to play out. Of course, the lows would likely be sooner, perhaps in October or so, something like this for Bitcoin, but you'd have some period of chop presumably before eventually heading higher. So this probably has to be our most likely case. We've had a sell-off similar to the previous bear market, similar to bear markets in the past, and we would imagine the bear market to play out in similar fashion. If we do take the previous high to the previous low, you had around a 77% down move. If we were to see some kind of diminishing returns, maybe let's say we go down 70% or so, that could take you to around maybe $37,000. That's sort of a potential low I'd be looking at on Bitcoin. We could draw in a head and shoulders pattern here, with this being the left shoulder. You've got the head up here, and you've got a smaller right shoulder down here, but we seem to have broken that pattern. And if you're looking at a potential price prediction here, then you take the head down to the neckline and you drag it here. And if you look at that, we actually have a target of around $39,000, $40,000, something like that on the head and shoulders pattern playing out fully. And that would coincide with a diminishing losses framework where you maybe go down 70%, maybe 67%, something like this from the highs here. So I would expect the low on Bitcoin to come somewhere around the $37,000 level, something like this, if we're talking absolute low. Of course, very difficult to perfectly predict those kind of things, but that would be my most likely guess as to where the low will come, and I would say that's probably going to be sometime in October. My bias has to be that the rally we're getting here is just a little bit of a counter-trend rally. You're probably going to maybe even come up to around $74,000, something like this is possible, before perhaps selling off further. I mean, the rallies that you get, the recovery rallies, can be quite extreme, so always possible that we could go even higher on a little bounce here before the bearish trend resumes. Let's add some other charts in to give some confirmation that perhaps we are seeing this regular bear market playing out. So the first chart I'd be looking at here is the Bitcoin over gold chart. Now, Bitcoin has broken through quite a lot of potential support that you could have had on this chart, and it looks to me like we're just going to go back down to the bottom of this parallel channel on the Bitcoin to gold chart. This support on this particular chart does stretch all the way back to 2017. So it's been quite reliable for lows. Of course, in the previous bear market, you didn't even quite get down here. But I imagine if you had a nastier bear market than in the previous 2022 bear market, then you could see Bitcoin definitely getting down to these particular lows. And that would be another 40% underperformance compared to gold. So keep in mind that gold could even come down as well, and Bitcoin just go down even more. Remember, if we are saying that Bitcoin could get down to around $37,000, that would be around a 46% move from here. So you'd imagine we're underperforming gold by around 40%. Maybe gold comes down as well to be in line with this particular chart playing out accurately. So perhaps we do come down, test this bottom of the parallel before heading back up, maybe even to the top of the parallel again in the future. Another interesting chart here is Bitcoin over the S&P. We've broken this support. Maybe we come up to retest quickly. This is maybe the recovery rally that we're experiencing, going to be a retest of this particular trend line, support line, and then we can head back down to the bottom of this parallel channel, which has typically been support. So it's possible we could have a further 34% underperformance versus the S&P. Not quite as bad as versus gold, which would sort of suggest to me that the markets in general are going to become a little bit more risk off. There might not even be a massive crash in the markets. It could be only, as much as 10%, 15%, something like this. But with that, you may be bringing Bitcoin down to very depressed levels before then resuming higher. Alternatively, it's possible we do have quite a nasty bear market in the stock market in general, and you do get this underperformance before heading higher. And there's seemingly a similar thing going on with the BTC over the NASDAQ. Again, we have a support level, but I imagine this will be probably broken through at some point, and we will potentially underperform the NASDAQ on Bitcoin a further 45%. Now, I'm not necessarily sure how you would get here. You'd probably have to have the markets in general sell off, but then NASDAQ would have to catch a bid and begin to rally probably before Bitcoin does. And if that were to happen, or perhaps you have this playing out a bit later on in the year and the underperformance won't be so great, if you do see it coming out a bit later in the year, perhaps you could get only a 43% underperformance, something like this. But I would imagine if we were to get down to these levels, then perhaps the NASDAQ will just catch a bid earlier than Bitcoin, run up a bit, and that strength then will allow Bitcoin to potentially begin a new move upwards. There could be something playing out in that way. Alternatively, maybe you do get caught by this support line and only underperform the NASDAQ by a further sort of 15%. That is also possible. And maybe we see Bitcoin and the NASDAQ both go down together, but Bitcoin catch a bid from here. So these are possibilities that we should be looking at. If we wanted to look at a potential bullish view on Bitcoin, what might we say? If I really wanted to have a bullish bias, I'd probably draw this trend line and I'd say, you know what? We almost got there. We almost tagged this powerful trend line. Maybe people were front running this particular level, and that can be a springboard for price to go up. Perhaps you could also look at this period here in 2019 where you did have a pretty decent price action on Bitcoin up to into the summer, but then you sold off until 2020 and you didn't have as extreme of a bear market, although you still were down 70% or so. I don't know if I really buy this. I think it's more likely that the 4-year cycle is just playing out as it often does. This was sort of mid-cycle, what was going on here. And you had the COVID crash and whatnot as well, which affected things. So I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if I buy that argument. I think it's more straightforward to argue that we're just experiencing a very similar bear market playing out as you've had back in 2022. And in fact, back in 2018, you also had price come down substantially, put in the sell signal and whatnot. And that was again like an 84% move down. So I imagine we're just going to have diminishing losses. We're still going to have a nasty bear market here. And perhaps we are going down to the $37,000 level, something around here, maybe even a bit higher, a bit lower. Hard to say the exact bottom, but I would imagine we're going to have a further sell-off. The NASDAQ and the S&P have not actually broken down yet. If they were to come down, all the way to the bottom of this parallel channel, for example, on the S&P, you're looking at potentially a 20% correction, which would be very nasty, I think. And that could be the catalyst, some kind of a big move down in the market in general. If something breaks in terms of private credit concerns or the AI trade, something going wrong in that department, then you could see the markets begin a big sell-off. And perhaps that would coincide with Bitcoin. If the NASDAQ were to come down, for example, 10% here or even more, all the way down to this particular level at 492, that could be an 18% correction. Maybe we'll even get a bigger sell-off if the S&P goes down. You would expect the Nasdaq to underperform. And in such a case, I think we could be hitting that target of around $37,000 on Bitcoin. For the relief rally, if there is one, I would not expect us to go much beyond 75,000, something in this range, maybe 74,000, because there is some resistance here. And as we already noticed, there is the 50-day EMA as well here, which could provide a bit of resistance. Maybe you'll get a bit beyond that, but I would imagine you roll over after getting there on Bitcoin. It's possible you could have a bigger relief rally, I suppose. But I personally wouldn't be trying to time relief rallies. If anything, they would be probably an opportunity to just add to a short position or begin a short position if that's something you're interested in doing. But generally, playing these kind of bounces is dangerous and difficult. I mean, you could do it if if you know what you're doing, but that's just something to keep in mind. If we take a look at Ethereum, you've got a support around 1550. This correlates to essentially the support on Bitcoin that I drew in before, be around the $58,000 level or something like this. I imagine if price gets there, it may even break through as you get a large waterfall decline all the way perhaps to the $37,000 mark or that sort of region on Bitcoin. If we're going to get down there, then it could mean much lower prices for Ethereum. Perhaps we could be even targeting as low as maybe $900 for some kind of a double bottom here. That being said, there's another chart that's quite interesting, which is this one here, and it's basically the crypto market divided by Bitcoin is how you can see this chart. So this measures the outperformance, underperformance relatively of all cryptocurrencies compared to Bitcoin. So this includes Ethereum, Solana, all the random altcoins that you have. And if this parallel channel holds, which I think it probably will do. Of course, you had this big wick down in October with massive liquidations, but I'm not going to count that. But this could signify we have a further 8.7% underperformance to come on the cryptos in general. So if we factor that in, maybe Ethereum is only going to underperform Bitcoin by a further 8%. We said Bitcoin could be coming down by around 40% or so. So I would imagine that correlates to Ethereum coming down by another 50, maybe a little bit more, 55%, something like this. And again, if we look on the Ethereum chart where that would correspond to, that's probably going to leave you, around somewhere around this $900 level, around this support previously. So that to me is looking like the most likely outcome. I think Ethereum may come down to these sort of levels. I know that seems hard to believe. Of course, very low prices for people that have been in the crypto space for a long time. They see ETH at these prices and think, wow, that's really something. But I think you could definitely get there. And to me, that would probably even be a good time to start buying altcoins when you have Bitcoin so depressed. Presumably, there will be room for the altcoins to begin to outperform Bitcoin on some level as well if we were to get to those sort of prices. I would imagine the next cycle that you have where Bitcoin goes up again, the altcoins will actually do quite well since they're already trading essentially at the bottom of this range. In the previous bull market, you had a bear market here and altcoins did not even get down to the bottom of the parallel channels. So I would imagine you're going to have a much better cycle for the alts, for the Ethereum, for the Solana, for even the smaller alts. If we do get back down here and we enter another bullish cycle for Bitcoin and altcoins, I think you're going to have a massive outperformance, quite likely, maybe possible. Alternatively, we may be chopping around at the bottom of this channel for some time. It's sort of going to depend on monetary policy and what the Fed does end up doing. I could imagine that if you do get interest rates going all the way down to zero and quantitative easing happening and things like this, then there could be that massive outperformance. Alternatively, we may have to grind around here if that does not occur. If interest rates have to remain relatively high, then you might not see much outperformance in altcoins, and even in Bitcoin might also have to chop around for quite some time. Now, to be fair, my broader thesis is that the market is going to have a bit of a troublesome time, particularly if the AI trade collapses in on itself, and if you get some kind of stagflationary situation where the Fed ends up being trapped in a very difficult position where they cannot really help the economy. There's also the yen carry trade to consider, the private credit concerns. So that being said, often the markets do price in negative events ahead of time. So if we do trade all the way down to sort of 40,000 on Bitcoin, I would imagine that there's the possibility for you to have already experienced most of the downward price action. And then even if you're in a recession, even if the AI trade has imploded and you have a bit of a bearish period for the markets, then perhaps you are already beginning to build a base that you can then expand from in terms of the price heading higher going forward. Markets are forward looking, so there is this to keep in mind. Circle has already broken the downwards parallel channel that we drew in previously, which is a very bullish sign for the stock, so that's good. You've got that going for you. And certainly I would anticipate at some point a retest of this parallel channel, maybe around $90. Before, if you're able to hold it, you can potentially go even higher on Circle. So, of course, it's possible that this breakout could fail and Circle comes back into this parallel channel, but this is definitely a counterpoint to all the bearishness that it seems is occurring. You know, if Bitcoin does end up going down to $40,000, it's hard to imagine Circle just breaking out and going to all-time highs. But I suppose time will tell. This may still be just a bear market rally in some way, but equally the price action looks very strong. So this is certainly a counterpoint to the bearish narrative. However, we've got the treasury stocks, MicroStrategy and BMNR, which are suffering. Of course, you'd imagine they will essentially trade in lockstep with the crypto prices unless you get NAV compression happening, which happened last bear market, but it seems like that's not really happening to quite the same extent this time around. Perhaps if you got massive drops in the Bitcoin price, then the NAVs could compress and get you to the bottom of this parallel channel, for example, on BMNR. I'm not sure about that though. And Hood is a similar story you've broken down. So perhaps Circle is just the outlier since it's all about the stablecoin technology, and perhaps there is an argument to be bullish on that independent of the crypto markets in general. I could certainly see that. And personally, I am very bullish on stablecoins as an idea and as a market. But these are all things to consider. Certainly, I don't think stocks like Duolingo and Adobe have bottomed out just yet. I think it's quite possible we may be heading lower, or if you're going to reverse the trend, you at least need some period of chopping around for momentum to shift back in the positive direction. If we're looking on Duolingo and on Adobe, for example, while it's possible you could have hit some kind of lows, I guess, you still need some time to reverse this bearish momentum and get back on track. And I think it's the same story for Bitcoin. So I would be looking at this software correlation as quite an important one. Perhaps that correlation will eventually break down if AI agents and the like are using cryptocurrencies and the rest of it. But for now, it seems the correlation is going to hold. So I would wait for software to enter a bullish regime, or at least put in some buy signals. I would wait for that before entering Bitcoin again. I think that could be a nice way of finding an earlier buy on Bitcoin if software stocks, for example, are putting in bullish signals before Bitcoin itself is. So also something to consider there. But yeah, overall quite a difficult market to navigate, but I think we have to remain bearish as our most likely case here. We've looked at all the charts. We can take a look at Bitcoin dominance as well. Why not? It's actually been in a downtrend for some period of time. So if we are holding this parallel channel, which it looks like you're doing, then we could in fact see Bitcoin dominance going even higher, which I guess would correspond to the slight further underperformance of altcoins before they hit some kind of a bottom. And this would sort of correlate to that chart. You know, if you did head back up to the top of this range, you'd be getting maybe a 13% or so move in Bitcoin, which would correspond to that period of underperformance for the alts. Maybe you wouldn't even get as high as here. Maybe you have like a double top on Bitcoin dominance, something like this, 9%. And I think that could correspond to hopefully, maybe, potentially the beginning of outperformance for alts, although I imagine you'll have a period of chop and waiting around before that happens. I think the hardest part here for me, the most difficult thing to predict is, okay, we may have a bottom on Bitcoin, let's say around $40,000, right? But what actually gets you going again? Like, how can the market really recover? Because we're already seeing quite some negative price action, and this is before the S&P and QQQs, etc., even do enter a full-on bear market, right? So there is very much a concern in the back of my mind that if you do have some real underperformance in the S&P, for example, if we get an extended bear market like you had in 2022, perhaps even a bear market that's worse for various reasons, right? Potentially higher inflation makes it harder for the Fed to cut due to oil prices and tariffs and all the rest of it. Potentially AI makes it harder for the economy to recover because people have lost their jobs to AI. The companies don't want to hire employees as much. I'm seeing a scenario in which there is like a really bad bear market coming, and I'm just a little bit concerned that the historical parallels that we're drawing for Bitcoin and perhaps the relative valuation charts that we did look at for Bitcoin will even break the lower parts of their parallel channel. I'm just imagining if you have a very severe bear market, even a depression perhaps, or a bad recession that the Fed cannot really bail the markets out of, made worse by yen carry trade, by the AI bubble popping, by employees being laid off because of AI and companies not really wanting to rehire. If you do have a bad bear market, then what does that mean for Bitcoin? Is it realistically going to be able to hold up well? Perhaps it will, and perhaps these charts that we've shown will, put in a bottom and Bitcoin will be able to recover, or perhaps not recover immediately, but just sort of chop around. You may have a period of stagnation where prices don't go up for some period of time. I don't know. difficult to say. Will the Bitcoin cycle follow as it historically has done, or will the bear market be even worse than in the past? That's the thing that I'm struggling right now to grapple with. It's entirely possible that that I may not be being bearish enough, essentially, on Bitcoin. I think, I suppose only time will tell. Either the markets will end up not suffering as much as I'm imagining they might, and we may just head higher. The Fed may be able to cut rates and stimulate the economy again. Maybe the AI concerns won't be too much of a problem, and in fact, you'll get a lot of economic growth and productivity as a result of the increased use of AI. And perhaps then you could have even a bigger blow off top as you go into a final sort of end to the proper market cycle. Or perhaps we'll have a worse bear market than anticipated, and it will be very hard to recover from, take quite some years. Perhaps Bitcoin will go down even more than these sort of models would suggest. Regardless, we can at least make sure that we're always following the trend and on the right side of the trend, and that's just what I'm going to be doing. There's not really a rush in my eyes to be jumping in here when the bearish momentum is in full force. I'd rather wait until this turns, until we enter a bullish regime once again. Typically, when Bitcoin does enter bullish regimes, it's quite a good chance to be getting in again. So I'm just going to wait, as I will on software, for the momentum to turn. And once it does, then we can think about getting into the riskier assets once again. So with that being said, I hope all that information is very helpful. Subscribe as always for more videos and daily chart analysis, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.